Hello everyone. So today we will be talking about how to conduct something that is called a thematic analysis. So before we start on what exactly are the steps required in doing a thematic analysis, let us first look at the method itself, and let's discuss some important bits of it. For example, it's epistemology. That's one of the things. So whenever you have a method, that's one of the first things that you will be asking yourself, that what is the epistemology? Because when you're selecting a method, the method has to make sense. It has to be coherent. The method needs to be coherent with your research methods. Right? Sorry, not with your research methods, with your research questions. Because if your research questions assume a particular kind of epistemology, right, that could be a realist epistemology, right? It could be a phenomenological epistemology, or it could be a social constructionist epistemology. Whatever the epistemology that your research question set out with, right, your method needs to be consistent with that kind of epistemology, right? So when we have a method such as thematic analysis, right, what exactly are the epistemological assumptions behind the method, right? That is something that we need to ask ourselves each time whenever we are confronted with a new method, whenever we're looking at a new method, right? So the thing about thematic analysis is that it does not assume within itself any epistemology. So it enjoys what a lot of researchers call epistemological freedom, right? Or, the authors of the book that we're using, they do not like this term epistemological freedom, because to them that seems to signal that the method does not have any epistemology. Rather, what they like to call it is epistemological flexibility. Now, initially we said that every method does have some sort of, epistemological assumptions, and therefore, not every method will be, let's say, consistent with, research questions that assume a more realist epistemology, or research questions that assume a phenomenological epistemology, or research questions that assume a social constructionist epistemology, right? So then how is this possible that thematic analysis as a method enjoys epistemological freedom? That what this means is, epistemological freedom or epistemological flexibility, whatever you choose to call it, right? What that basically means is that the method in itself, right, it's not tied to any epistemological assumptions. And this will become clearer to you as you move further and you look at methods that do have epistemological assumptions tied to them. When you look at something like, for example, IPA, which is interpretive phenomenological analysis, that is, very strongly wedded to a phenomenological epistemology. Or when you look at, several other methods such as Foucauldian discourse analysis, which again, has a social constructionist epistemology. So thematic analysis as a method, right, is not tied to any epistemological assumptions. That is why we say that it enjoys epistemological freedom or epistemological flexibility, right? Now, what does that mean? Does that mean that if you do a research using thematic analysis, your research does not, fall into any three of these categories? That research will not be realist, it will not be phenomenological, or it will not be social constructionist? Do you think that is what it means? Let me repeat the question. My question is that if the method itself does not assume any epistemological assumptions, or is not linked to any epistemological assumption, right? Does that mean that the research that you do using thematic analysis will also be free of any epistemology? It will not be realist or phenomenological or social constructionist? The answer to that is no. Any sort of, any knowledge that you aim to create, right, will have certain epistemological assumptions tied to it, right? So if the method itself does not assume those, epistemological, it does not make it clear what the epistemological assumptions are, they're not tied to the method, then where exactly do they come from? So as long as thematic analysis is concerned, right, the phenomenological assumptions come from your research questions, right? And you can use thematic analysis with, all three of these different approaches. So you can use it with a realist epistemology, with a phenomenological epistemology, and a social constructionist epistemology. So here we'll put ticks instead of the crosses, because all three of these epistemologies, it's possible to create research that subscribes to any one of these different epistemologies using thematic analysis. This is why, until very recently, thematic analysis has not even been recognized as a method in its own right. Now, why is that? Why do you think thematic analysis would not be considered a method in its own right? Well, one of the reasons is, again, it does not have any epistemological assumptions tied to it. Secondly, some form of thematic analysis is central to all sorts of qualitative research, right? Because when you're doing qualitative research, what exactly are you doing? You are, more often than not, you are generating something that are called themes, right? And this is something that's central to a lot of qualitative research, even if it's not thematic analysis. And that's why, certain researchers are of the opinion that thematic analysis does not constitute a separate research method in its own right. Rather, it's something like a skill that you use along with, or you use as a part of, a lot of other different methods that you use in qualitative researches, right? Now, what exactly does that mean? What is a theme? How would you define a theme? So let me just show you an extract of your book. So here you have this extract from your book, which basically is trying to make sense of what a theme is, right? And it's looking at all of these different researchers and what they've said about what a theme is, right? How would you define a theme? So Joff here says that a theme refers to a specific pattern of meaning found in the data, right? Braun and Clark proposed that a theme captures something important about the data in relation to the research question and represents some level of patterned response or meaning within the data set. Right. Then you have Boyatzis, who describes a theme as a pattern in the information that at a minimum describes and organizes the possible observations and at maximum interprets aspect of the phenomena. Now, one thing that you might have noticed is that all three of these different takes on what a theme exactly is, right? All of them use the word pattern in describing a theme, right? So what does this tell you? Does this tell you something about what a theme essentially ought to look like? So basically, whenever you get a data set, right, and you start to look at it, right, you might notice right, that there are certain patterns in the data set, right? There are certain patterns of meaning, right? And those patterns of meaning tell you something about your research question. Now that's, another important bit of it, right? So they relate to your research question in a particular way, right? And your theme, at minimum might, and this pattern might at a minimum describe and organize the possible observations or your data set, and at maximum it might interpret it, right? What that means is something that we'll look into more detail as we look at certain examples of thematic analysis, right? And we get into how exactly a thematic analysis is attempted. But before we get into that, let me tell you about these two different types of thematic analysis that you might have. Actually, not two, but there could be many different types, depending on, again, what your research questions look like, because that's one of the things that we've talked about, that when we look at thematic analysis, right, so it can take on any of the three different epistemologies that we'd already discussed. But when I talk about two different kinds of thematic analysis, right, what I mean by that is that when researchers are doing thematic analysis, right, they might have, again, depending on your research question, right, different ways of approaching the data that they've gathered, right? So thematic analysis is best suited to these two different approaches, right? One of them is what is called the social phenomenology approach. And the other one is called the social representations approach. Now, what exactly are the differences? When you're asking questions using social phenomenology approach, right, you're looking at how people experience a particular phenomena. On the other hand, when you're looking at social representations, you're looking at how individuals or institutions represent a particular phenomena. Now, what could that possibly mean? When you're constructing a particular question and it subscribes to a social phenomenological approach, right, it will more often than not look something like this. For example, what are the experiences with online classes of psychology students at FC, right? What is this question doing? It's looking at how someone experiences a particular phenomena. Does that make sense? The phenomena is online classes, but you're looking at how are students experiencing the phenomena of online classes? How are students, psychology students more particularly, at FC experiencing the phenomena of online classes, right? So with social phenomenology, that is something that you're interested in. Another example could be something like, what are individuals So that could be another question, that, what are individuals' experiences with using an online dating app? Again, that looks at how people are experiencing a particular phenomena. The phenomena here, again, is using an online dating app, and you're interested in how people are experiencing this phenomena, right? So that's what social phenomenology looks at. It looks at how a particular phenomena is experienced by individuals. Right? Whereas, when you're using a social representations kind of approach, right, you're looking at how is a phenomena represented. What does this mean? So, for example, your question could look something like, how does media represent the novel coronavirus, right? So here you'll be looking at, when you're asking this kind of question, you'll be interested in what sort of words the media uses when it talks about the novel coronavirus. You'll be interested in how images are particularly, certain images are used to represent the novel coronavirus. So that's everything that you'll be looking at, right? But here basically what you're doing is you're looking at a phenomena, which is the novel coronavirus, and you're looking at how it is represented, right? Another sort of question here could be, for example, how do Pakistani dramas portray domestic abuse, right? So here again, the phenomena that you're looking at is domestic abuse, and you're interested in how it is represented through a particular medium, which in this case is Pakistani dramas, right? So these are not two different kinds of thematic analysis, so as to say, but these are two different approaches which are very well suited to a thematic analysis. Because we've talked about this, that, here, for example, when we talk about social phenomenology, right? And here what we saw was, when we were looking at what exactly a theme is, we saw this definition which says that, a theme describes and organizes the possible observations, right? So when we get answers to this, right, to both of these, right, so we will get at least a description of, here what psychology students' experiences with online classes is, or what are individuals' experiences with using an online dating app, right? Furthermore, when we sort of move further looking at this definition, because it not just talks about description, but it also talks about interpretation, right? That's when we get to these further two distinctions within thematic analysis, and these are basically dependent on what the researcher is interested in looking at, really, rather than anything that's built into the method, which are what are called manifest or explicit meanings, right, or more latent meanings. And this will really go into your interpretation as well, because remember when we did the chapter on interpretation, so we talked about these two different styles of interpretation. One was the suspicious style of interpretation, and the other was a more empathic style of interpretation, right? When we're talking about manifest, so here we'll be only looking at themes, right, or only looking at meanings within the data that are there, right, that are present in the data. However, here when we talk about latent meaning, right, So what we'll be doing is that we will be interpreting and going beyond the surface level of the data. Now, this is not to say that, in manifest, when we're doing this style, in which we're looking at meanings that are present, that doesn't mean that there's no interpretation involved. There is always interpretation involved, no matter what you're doing, right? Similarly, a lot of researchers, when they're using thematic analysis, they use this language in which they say that, themes, they say themes emerged. So they use this language. And a lot of researchers have problems with this sort of, this sort of terminology, because they say nothing sort of emerges in itself. You really have to take out themes from the data, and no themes are emerging from the data, right? So here as well, it doesn't mean that you're not, indulging in any interpretation, rather that you're sticking to what's on the surface, right? So that's what it is, that you're not putting in a lot of interpretation. The role here of interpretation is a lot larger than what it is here, right? Now let's take an example. So for example, when you have this kind of question here, that what are the experiences with online classes of psychology students at FC? This sort of question will be very well suited to a manifest kind of approach, in which whatever is there in the data, that's what you're reporting, right? This kind of question could work. This again would be well suited to a more manifest kind of approach. It depends. So if you're, for example, research question, even if it is that what are students' experiences of online classes, or if you sort of want to make it more latent, right, you could sort of modify your research question in such a way and say that what is the meaning making of students. Let me just write that down. Revise that. So you could have something like, how do students something like that sort of moves below the surface, right? And this could sort of, again, when you're doing something which is more latent meaning, right, you sometimes do look at certain other theoretical frameworks and use them to code your data. That's another distinction that I'll touch upon here, which is basically inductive versus deductive coding. But before we do that, let me just come back here and look at this. So how do students make meaning of their online class experiences? So this, requires you to go, beyond the surface, and not even, the question in itself does not imply that, but if that is your approach, if, you are approaching the data with a more suspicious style of interpretation, right? So then you could be more interested in latent meanings rather than the manifest meanings. I hope that makes sense. So whatever the students are saying, right, you will not take that to be, their meaning making of their online class experiences. Rather, you would like to be suspicious and use, a more suspicious approach, and look beyond the words and look deeper in terms of what their motivations could be, right? And conclude something, about your research question, which is not necessarily manifest in whatever it is that they're telling you, right? So that is basically the difference. I hope that makes sense, right? So now we've covered pretty much, the approaches. We've talked a little bit about what themes are. I would like to talk about inductive versus deductive coding, because sometimes what you're doing, so let's just talk about the steps that are involved in a thematic analysis. So number one, whenever you have a data set, right, the number one step is always to read and reread the data in order to make yourself very, very familiar with the data, right? And then what you do is, the next step is that you start coding. Now, what exactly is coding, and how is coding different from a theme? So basically what a code does is that it captures, or it's basically captures a unit of meaning, right? So it's a basic unit of meaning. Whereas when we considered what a theme is, we saw again and again that a theme is rather a pattern of meaning, right? When we consider an example, I hope that this will become clearer, but let's just stick to this for now. So a code is a basic unit of meaning. A lot of researchers encourage that you do line by line coding, which means that you code each and every line, right? Sometimes researchers also recommend that from codes then you move on to categories, right? But you could basically then look at your codes, right, reflect on them, and then what you could do is that you could start merging them into themes when you start seeing patterns within the codes, right? So then you start forming themes out of these codes, right? Now, when we talk about coding, there is such a thing as inductive versus deductive coding. Now, when we're using inductive coding, what we're doing is that we're sticking to the data set. We're staying very, very close to the data set. We're not using anything from outside. We're not using any theoretical framework from outside in order to make sense of our data, right? We're using the data itself to generate these codes. However, when we talk about deductive coding, right? So in deductive coding, we already have, let's say, a certain set of codes that we're trying to fit our data into. We already have a theoretical framework that we're relying on, right? So for example, the book gives a very simple example, which is, I think, great, because it talks about how you could ask different individuals about what they watch for TV and how much time they spend on some category or watching television, and someone says to you that I watch it just for leisure, and I watch it in my free time, right? So you could have these already created codes, and one of them could be something like pure entertainment, right? So you could fit this person's response in this already generated code that you had of pure entertainment, right? So that is an example of deductive coding, that you've already, you've gone over some research which is relevant to your topic, and you have already created a list of codes. And using those list of codes, you look at your data and you analyze your data. Certain researchers use a combination of both of these approaches. So what they do is that they start off with deductive coding, but then they allow new codes to emerge from the data set as well. So a combination is always also possible, right?